Good morning, Malcolm. How are you?
Oh, good morning, Julie. I'm well. Sitting before a bright window of my desk on a sort of clean, clear morning after the storm last night. Happily, most of the trees that I can see from my window are all still standing, so we didn't get it as bad as some places.
Yes, there was a fearsome storm last night. I told you I had the kind of irrational feeling that it was going to blow down my house, which it didn't. But you are right that I think after a storm like that is particularly clear. And
Yeah, yeah.
yes,
The air is sort of cleansed and scoured somehow, and the sun
yeah,
is brighter.
yes. And I'm sure there's a metaphor in that in life that sometimes after storms we feel a bit
I'm
cleansed.
sure there is. Yeah.
But it's appropriate that we are happy about the trees because I have asked you, and I'm very happy that you said yes, to talk with me about one of the metaphors in my book, which is people as trees. And you said it is a topic that you particularly like and are interested in. But before we dive in, why don't you tell people a bit about yourself and what you're up to these days?
Well, as I say, I'm Malcolm Guite. I'm a priest of the Church of England, but also have been an academic, and I'm a poet. Um, I write academically about the links between literature and theology, the meeting place of literature and theology. I suppose I try to set forth what you might call a theology of the imagination or a defense of the imagination as a truth-bearing faculty. And of course, that's very pertinent to the subject of your book and our subject, which is metaphor, because you need imagination in order to make a metaphor, in order to see intuitively and imaginatively the links between two apparently different things, and as it were, to carry meaning over, which is what metaphor means, from one to the other. That's essentially an imaginative act. So that's part of the case that one wants to make, because we couldn't think without metaphor, that imagination is as much about finding out the truth as reason is. It's another of our truth-bearing faculties. It's not just about making stuff up.
Yes, and I'm very pleased to be talking with you first. When I wrote this book, which is about metaphor, and of course, metaphor is in a greater family of figurative language and imagination. But I think sometimes people, yes, I think sometimes people can have the sense of it being kind of either a pedantic thing, like something they learned in their, freshman English class, or something that is sort of ornamental to life, but not essential to thinking and believing. So can you start, I thought it would be appropriate to ask a poet about metaphor to begin with. So can you define for our listeners kind of what a metaphor is, what a simile is, and maybe say a little bit more of kind of the role it plays, not just in poetry, but also in how we think and come to think about truth.
Well, the word metaphor, almost all language, I think we should say to begin with, has some kind of embedded metaphor in it. I mean, if you use even apparently abstract language like transcendent, you're still actually conjuring up the image of one thing and another thing above it. It's ascend, but it's the same as ascend. So all our thinking, in some sense, is pictorial thinking. There's sometimes we've forgotten the picture. It's like focus, for example, is actually the Latin word for a fireplace. And when people say that the fireplace is the focus of the room, I mean, that's what focus originally meant. So even the word metaphor is, in its origins, a metaphorical word. That is to say that the forebit of metaphor that you recognize from the spelling that meta, and from the use of the word meta, that metaphor is a Greek word which has been borrowed by English and carried over into English. And the forebit of metaphor is the same as, like, Christopher, the one who carries Christ, or even English ferry. And it's about carrying something across, carrying something through or over or across. And that's what a metaphor does, is it takes, it employs an image to carry a meaning across. So, I mean, just obviously, I've already given metaphors in language, but I mean, it's an interesting fact that there are a number of things we find out there in nature, in the world of phenomena, which are extraordinarily apt and helpful as pictures through which we think about or account for visible pictures, through which we think about or account for our invisible interior experience. I think the fact that there are those correspondence raises and perhaps begins to answer all kinds of questions. If you took the most bleak, reductive, materialist sort of random view of what it is to be a human being, where we're just an accidental concatenation of atoms whose mere random association accidentally produced this epiphenomenon of consciousness, you would expect us to be utterly isolated in here and there to be no correspondence between our inner experience and what's out there. But on the contrary, so to take trees, since we're going to talk about trees, it'd be almost impossible to describe all kinds of aspects of our inner experience or without appealing to trees. So when we say we need root and branch reform, we cannot help but think of organizations or families or nations as having roots and branches, or branches and fruit. And in fact, when we try to describe things like our own genetic lineage, lo and behold, we need the tree again. We speak of family trees. Everybody understands that. When we analyze the structure of thought and the way we weave trees, in the end, when we discuss a sentence, we end up with a tree image. So there's something about the tree which is immensely suggestive of it. Is as though the outward and visible thing has itself grown or evolved so as to be an almost perfect metaphor for more than one inward and spiritual experience. But that's true of lots of other things. I mean, the experience of sleeping and then waking, or of winter and then spring, and the analogy between morning and spring, and the way those become metaphors for a spiritual experience, which we might broadly want to call resurrection or renewal. All of those things cannot be, the number of correspondences is so great, and the depth and aptness of the correspondence is so powerful, that it seems to be an argument for saying that there is a mind behind the cosmos, and that there's some relation between the mind that made the world and the mind that's in us, for much correspondence to be there. But that's perhaps a separate metaphysical argument. But I hope that covers what a metaphor is.
Yes, and I'm so glad that you framed it in that way, because I keep on having people ask me, what did you want people to get out of the book? And I think the thing that I wanted them to get was, I wanted to ask them to pay attention to the world, to our experiences in it, whether that is looking at a tree or just the feeling of, I've been waking really early because I just got back from Asia, and so I've had jet lag. And so I've had the experience of watching the light come up several days in a row. And I believe, for all the reasons that you just described, that when we pay attention to our experiences in the world, in the visible world, it kind of illuminates and reminds us of kind of the integrity of things and the sense that there is correspondence and meaning.
Yeah, the correspondence. I think any poet's mind delights in correspondence and connection. That's partly what one is after. But I'm glad you talked about paying attention, because there is a danger if you rush too quickly to the idea of being metaphorical, as you have a quick glance at something out there and you say, okay, I've got the basic idea of it, now I'm going to apply it metaphorically everywhere, and that results in bad art or bad poetry.
Yes.
Because if you believe the image is wise, that the image carries with it meaning, and that when you write, some of that meaning in the image is going to be disclosed, then in that case, every aspect of the image is important. The more closely you look at it, the more literally you understand what it is. Paradoxically, the more potentially metaphorical it becomes. There's more in it. I mean, there's I remember one of the clergy church I was serving was also a scientist, and he was preaching on Good Friday, and he was using, as it were, the image that sometimes the cross is referred to as a tree. And he suddenly started talking about photosynthesis, about the way the tree and the branches are taking, and he just used the word atmosphere, and the metaphorically, which is a good atmosphere or a bad atmosphere, and the kind of poisonous atmosphere of a guilty conscience or a sinful world. And how he said, rather like a tree that takes these gases that we can't deal with, and by combining them with light from the heavens, produces this other gas, oxygen, which we need to live. He said that's a little bit of an analogy of what is going on all the time because of Jesus has died on the cross for us, that he's taken. And I thought, wow, that's really helpful. I mean, but that was somebody who's examined a plant closely enough to understand a little bit more about how it works. And it put me in mind of a wonderful phrase in one of Coleridge's letters. Coleridge was, I mean, a great writer and philosopher and theologian, but certainly no enemy to science. He was very friendly with, among other people, Davies, Sir John Davies, who was really the father of modern chemistry. And there's a wonderful bit where he says, I'm after one of Davies' lectures to increase my stock of metaphors. Now, it's not that the scientist was doing anything metaphorical. He was doing something very physical and literal. But Coleridge in the end thought that well, he called the whole of the physical cosmos. He actually thought it's not only what it is itself, it's so continuously metaphorical that it is in fact language. And so when he imagines his little boy growing up in the Lake District, he says, "So shalt thou," he didn't say, shalt thou see and hear some interesting geography and meteorology. He says, "So shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds of that eternal language which thy God doth utter, who doth teach himself in all things in himself." So yeah, I think it's right at the heart of our human perception of the world that we should recognize its metaphorical character.
Yes, and that, I mean, also you have all that beautiful language in scripture about, that he's created the earth by the words of his mouth, and then Jesus called it word, and so there's a sense of intelligibility. But I like what you said about the fittingness and unfittingness of various metaphors, because one of the things I kind of touch on in the book is how metaphors of machines or computers sometimes have kind of begin to creep in how we describe humans. And on some level, I think that you can make a metaphor of anything, right? It is possible to make a metaphor of anything. But there are ways in which machines are unfitting metaphors for human beings, because if we begin...
Or the totality of the machine is unfitting for the totality of the human being, because you're comparing the greater, the person, with the lesser.
Yes.
So I think that language about programming and reprogramming and memory banks and people's rewiring the hardware of someone's, I think all of that is damaging to the point of being blasphemous. And I think the prohibitions against idolatry. But that does not mean to say that we may only choose metaphors from nature.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, two of the poets that I draw from both in terms of literary craftsmanship and influence on the one hand, and actual example and spiritual on the other, are John Donne and George Herbert, who are regarded as metaphysical poets. And what distinguishes the metaphysical poets is the sheer ingenuity of their metaphors. And often those metaphors are drawn from, if you like, the everyday, and particularly for many of them, the scientific or rational world, but they're then made of metaphors they're renewed as metaphors of love. So, well, famously, Donne, who's saying goodbye to his beloved, he goes on a trip by sea to Germany, which obviously he can imagine the mariners with their compasses drawing circles and plotting charts. So he compares himself and his wife to a pair of compasses. And he says that even though he's the one that's going out doing the circumference, he's completely attached to the one that's turning. And then he has a nice metaphor about what happens to the slant one when it gets closer to home, but perhaps this is too early in the morning to unwrap that one. But that's a beautiful metaphor. Now, obviously, a pair of compasses is a lesser thing than the love of husband and wife, but a pair of compasses can be marshaled to illustrate one aspect of it. And that was the particular ingenuity of the metaphysical poets, that they could see everything that everybody just took for granted or thought was in a completely different category, and they could make it a metaphor for something profoundly intimate and human.
Yes, I love that. And I think that's something I didn't want to do with the book, was say it's all very bad to talk about machines, because I think that, again, there is this sense of intelligibility in all things, even machines, even that we can see things there, that there's meaning. And I think
Yeah,
that even in some ways, because one of the things I talk about as well is metaphors always have kind of an element of of the knot, that you are bringing a strange term over to another thing.
yeah,
And
yeah,
but I think that element of the knot, or knowing that a compass can't encompass all that is a human love,
yeah,
actually
yeah.
makes you pay more attention to both the love and to the compass.
Absolutely. And in fact, what is wrong and insidious with the common computer brain metaphor that we are given, the really insidious thing is that the people who use it are actually not, they've forgotten it's a metaphor. They think it's
Exactly.
literally the case. And the
Mm,
less, one of a metaphor is at its best when you recognize it with pleasure as a metaphor.
mm,
So in the poem where you imagine, what it might be like to be a tree, part of the movingness and power of that is that you are not yourself a tree. You may wish to be a tree. There's a lot about the tree that's infinitely desirable to be,
mm,
but you're not that. And yet what you discover in the metaphor is that there are certain characteristics of the tree which you can have. Now it helps that obviously in the biblical worldview and in the up until about the 17th century, there was a belief that we were in some sense a kind of epitome or index of nature, that
mm,
there was some aspect of everything in us. This was the old era of the microcosm and the macrocosm. So there was some sense in which, because God made us last, he put everything that he'd already made into us.
mm,
And so there was something tree-like about us and something sea-like about it. There was a genuine correspondence between rocks and bones and rivers and veins and eyes and
mm,
stars and so on. So they had a little bit more to work with. But yeah, you have to understand the distinction.
mm. All right. Well, I think now I want to actually relish a metaphor. So I wanted to have you read a poem that I think you love, but I'd also love to hear some of your own poetry about that metaphor that gives the title to the book, which is People as Trees.
Yeah.
So shall we start with reading? I have it here for me. I will read silently while you read to me. Um,
Yeah.
Saint Kevin and the Blackbird, by Seamus Heaney.
So yes, this is a poem in Seamus Heaney's. You see my rather well-worn copy. I treat Seamus Heaney books when they come out rather like I treated Bob Dylan albums. I go and get them the very day of release and do nothing for a week but absorb them.
Mm,
So I've been reading this poem since it came out in 1996, and it's been deepening in me ever since. So St. Kevin and the Blackbird by Seamus Heaney. And then there was St. Kevin and the Blackbird. The saint is kneeling, arms stretched out inside his cell, but the cell is narrow, so one upturned palm is out the window, stiff as a crossbeam, when a blackbird lands and lays in it and settles down to nest. Kevin feels the warm eggs, the small breast, the tucked neat head and claws, and finding himself linked into the network of eternal life, is moved to pity. Now he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and rain for weeks until the young are hatched and fledged and flown. And since the whole thing's imagined anyhow, imagine being Kevin. Which is he? Self-forgetful, or in agony all the time, from the neck on out down through his hurting forearms? Are his fingers sleeping? Does he still feel his knees? Or has the shut-eyed blank of under-earth crept up through him? Is there distance in his head, alone and mirrored clear in love's deep river? To labor and not to seek reward, he prays. A prayer his body makes entirely, for he has forgotten self, forgotten bird, and on the river bank, forgotten the river's name.
mm.
It's a wonderful poem.
It really is. It's really magnificent. So give us a bit of a poet's analysis of this. It's still sinking in for me.
So it's if you see it as it's printed out, it's in two parts. There's a little star between two parts. And that in itself actually reflects something metaphorical, because the first part is very, very physically detailed. It's very, very vivid about what you'd see. And the second part actually really, first of all, summons the imagination by name and asks a series of open and genuine questions. So the poet isn't telling you what to imagine. He's asking the kind of questions which provoke or prompt your imagination. So that's just an over the two parts, for what it's worth, are 12 liners. They're like slightly shortened sonnets. They're unrhymed, but they're written in tercets, and it's a form that he had developed in his previous book, Fieldwork, in a series of poems called Squarings. This is kind of like an extension of those. So the first thing to notice about the poem is it draws you in a very conversational way. It begins with the word "and." It's as though you're happening in on Seamus. He's got a pint in front of him, and they're all around telling stories, and they're telling convivial stories. Oh, and you told me, and then here's another one. You know, you're already in convivial storytelling mode. And then there was St. Kevin and the Blackbird. Then comes this beautiful description, which you note is in the present tense. He doesn't allow you to lock this event away in the past. In fact, he's playing with time all the time, because St. Kevin was, I believe, a 7th century or 6th or 7th century Irish saint whose centre is around Glendalough, where I was just recently. But the prayer that Kevin is praying in this, is which he gives you a line of, to labour and not to seek reward, is actually a prayer of St. Ignatius, who's 16th century saint. So he's already, you know, all these saints exist in a continuous present, as the poem exists in a continuous present with you. Now, the key thing is, why has Kevin got his hand out the window in the first place? Well, we're told his cell is narrow, but we might think, why didn't he just pray like that? Well, what he doesn't tell you, but he sort of expects you to know, and he gives you a hint in the word crossbeam, is that the Celtic saints prayed a thing called the cross vigil, which was to stand with both arms outstretched in order to be in and with Christ as he stretches arms out for us on the tree of the cross and bears the weight of the world. And if you try doing that for a while, indeed, the very thing that Heaney describes, in the second
agony from the neck down, the
neck
hurting
on his
forearms.
hurting forearms. So there's, if we're going to say, imagine what it's being like a tree, Kevin becomes a tree, as it were, accidentally, with his hand out the window for the Blackbird, while he is in the middle of imagining being Christ. So Christ is in the tree, you know, Christ is in the saint is in the tree. Do you see what I mean? So you can't read this, and you can't read the questions about, and Christ, of course, is the one who speaks everything into being, including the bird and Kevin. I mean, there's a very fine, another poem about a saint by Seamus Heaney, is his poem on St. Francis, I think his very first book, which begins when St. Francis preached love to the birds. And he compares the birds that are coming around to being like poems of Francis. And it calls the birds of holy words, a flock of words released for fun from his holy lips. Anyway, so we've got this thing of him, the description of the actual happening in the first part, which is he stretches out his arms in the cross vigil, and he's there for so long that a blackbird mistakes his hand for a branch and nests in it. And the turn, if you like, it's all just sheer description until you get to the 8th and 9th line, where he says, and finding himself linked into the network of eternal life, is moved to pity. Now he must hold his hand. Now, the word you might miss, if you didn't read it carefully, is eternal. Some people and some critics read this poem as though it were purely about the natural biological links between all of us and the rest of nature. And they read it as a poem of oneness with nature, which it is. It certainly is oneness with nature. It certainly is the ground rising up through him, not knowing the river's name because and it is an experience of oneness with the entire pattern of nature. But he says from the outset, it is that and it is more than that. He doesn't say the network of life or the network, he says the network of eternal life. The eternal life bit of it is the creator of all the things, the great imaginer who's imagining for it. So anyway, he's moved to pity and hold its hands. And then Heaney does a thing which some writers of imaginative works say you should never do, which is, if you like, to break the fourth wall. You know, that if I'm telling an imaginative story for a certain kind of thing, it's really important for me not to say, oh, it's just a story. Do you know what I mean? Because that would break the story, wouldn't I? But Heaney says, come on, you know and I know that this story is about Kevin has been made up. It's very unlikely to have actually been the case. But never mind, we're telling a story. And he's already put that in by saying, and then there was Kevin. But he gets right ahead. It says, since the whole thing's imagined anyhow, imagine being Kevin. Now, here's the great thing. This is, if you like, the bit that's, if you like, postmodern, to use a word that's don't know about it. An 18th century rationalist, and the kind of thing that obtained really up until the middle of the 20th century, would have said, since the whole thing's imagined anyway, let's ban it and not talk about it. Let's eliminate it. It's useless and vain. There's nothing to be gained from imagining things. Let's find out more about the biology of blackbirds, you know. But Heaney is now in a position in the 90s to say, since the whole thing's imagined anyhow, let's imagine some more. Let's go for it. Since we've got imagination on our side, the possibilities are limitless. But here's why my challenge to you: imagine being Kevin. And then I'm not going to tell you how to imagine being Kevin. I'm going to give you a couple of different possibilities. Which is it? Which is he, self-forgetful or in agony all the time? Now, it happens that Heaney himself, in the rest of the poem, develops the self-forgetfulness side of it. But he could have written a poem which developed the agony side of it. And I think it's really important that he puts agony all the time in there, because it links back to crossbeam. It links back to the thing, and it just reminds us of the Christ. It's rather like, I don't know, I mean, it probably came out before. There's a book by R.H. Vanstone called The Stature of Waiting. He also, as well in writing the book, he wrote a hymn which talks about love as having as standing with his arms out, exhausted, but his love is aching, spent, the world's stain. It's you know, about the Christ continuing to carry not just the blackbird and its nest out of a compassion, but actually all of us, in a sense, being held there. But that's very, very implicit. It's very implicit. I mean, you know, Heaney does not make that explicit at all, but he feeds you enough for you to be able to grasp it. But yeah, anyway, that's just some of the things that I find in there. But I mean, you probably find many things of your own as well. Since it asks us open questions, we can answer them differently.
No, I was going to say, I think the two things that it strikes in me is that it makes me read Christ's agony back into a tree, which perhaps sounds a little bit sad, but it makes me think that maybe on some level trees don't just hold birds' nests kind of because they must, but because there's this sense of choosing to hold a bird's nest.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, of course, the other thing which lies behind this, which Heaney certainly knows, is the dream of the rood, where the whole story of the crucifixion is told from the tree's point of view, about what it is to sustain. So I think that's there. I mean, the poem, so I read this, as I say, in 96. I mean, it's nearly 30 years ago, I guess. 20 years ago, is that right? I'm not sure. Maybe it's more.
28, yeah, yep. Because we're 2024.
Yeah. So it was the imaginative invitation was there, and I probably did, as a result of this poem, consider what it would be like to imagine oneself to be a tree on occasions, perhaps being with trees. So it meant that when I came, for example, to write my poem on Jesus saying, I am the vine, you are the branches, for my parable and paradox, it's not that I consciously remembered Heaney's poem. I didn't think, oh, I'll have a quick reread of Kevin and the Blackbird before. I had no conscious memory. I mean, it was in, to borrow another extended term, it was in, as it were, the leaf mold of my mind, you know, the leaves of these poems had fallen and, you know, nourished my imagination. But when I came to read, I read Kevin and the Blackbird on a recent little video thing of my own. And when I came to reread it, I thought, oh, goodness, this is how I came to write. Or without this poem, it's not, the poem is not scary. Without this poem, I would not have written my poem on I Am the Vine in the way I wrote it. In fact, I realized it was, you know, it's quite clear. Perhaps I can just illustrate it. I'll read it to you. And so I was writing a sequence of poems on the 7 great I am sayings of Jesus in John's Gospel, which interestingly begins with I am the bread and ends with I am the vine. So it's all kind of enclosed in something Eucharistic, I think. But anyway, it's a great saying of Jesus. I've been attracted to it in various ways. So I wrote a sonnet about it. Now, I was not consciously thinking of Heaney's poem. I probably hadn't read Heaney's poem for at least, say, 10 years, though I'd read it often, you know, maybe not 10 years, but I hadn't read it for a long time. But I recognize now, post hoc, that Heaney's poem opened something in my mind which enabled me to write this poem. So in that sense, it's not that I'm making a clever literary allusion to Heaney's poem at all. I mean, you can do that. It's that there is something essentially generative in Heaney's poem, generous and generative. And I think what's generative in Heaney's poem is the explicit invitation to imagine. You know, since the whole thing's imagined anyway, imagine being Kevin, and then the questions. I think that gave me a mode of writing of which I am unveiled myself, because by that time, because Heaney had altered the way I look at trees by his poetry, that was now an operative mode independent of him in my way of looking at things. But I wouldn't have had it. That's why poetry genuinely enlarges your mind and changes your perceptions. That's why it's a truth-bearing faculty. Anyway, I am the vine, and you are the branches, said Jesus. So here we go. How might it feel to be part of the vine? Not just to see the vineyard from afar, or even pluck the clusters, press the wine, but to be grafted in, to feel the stir of inward sap that rises from our root, himself deep planted in the ground of love, to feel a leaf unfold, a tender shoot, as tendrils curled unfurl, as branches give a little to the swelling of the grape in gradual perfection, round and full, to bear within oneself the joy and hope of God's good vintage till it's ripe and whole. What might it mean to bide and to abide in such rich love as makes the poor heart glad? So, I mean, there's lots of other things going on there, and obviously wine that maketh glad the heart of man is there, and you know, but the idea of imagining things that way, as was, I think, to take another metaphor, a seed, as it were, planted in the soil of my imagination by Heaney's poem, but so deep that I wasn't conscious of it when I wrote my poem.
I love that, and I love that poem particularly because I think one can hear that metaphor and it is beautiful, when Jesus says, I am the vine. But I think it's easy to kind of rush over. So to have all of those images, which really are you paying attention to a vine. What is it like?
Paying attention to vines, yes, something I like to do.
Yes.
Both
And
to the vine and the fruit of the vine, yeah.
yeah.
No, I mean, in fact, I wrote that poem in Linton. No, maybe we hadn't moved to Linton by then, but anyway, when we were living in Linton, there's one of the rare English vineyards was just over the hill from us, and we've visited that vineyard and drunk the wine from that vineyard. So, you know, I've walked around that vineyard with the vintner, with, you know, talking to me about when we had some really bad drought, you know, how the vines were all right because their roots are so deep and that kind of thing.
I love the line about God's vintage.
Yeah,
That's good,
yeah.
Vin. Yes,
Well,
and
obviously, it's got all, say that God's good vintage yet, so it's ripe and whole. Well, that, I mean, of course, wine itself, I mean, we can move from the tree metaphor through to the vine metaphor, and then wine itself is a really, really vital metaphor. I mean, which, of course, George Herbert has staggeringly in his poem, The Agony, where he, in the verse, which is about love, who knows not love, let him essay and taste that wine which, on the cross, a pike did set again a brooch, that's like broaching the barrel. And he ends up with this fantastic thing where he says, love is that liquor sweet and most divine, which my God feels as blood, but I as wine. Yeah.
I think to go back to the Heaney poem, when he says that he felt himself to be connected with a network of eternal life. I think that there's something about meditating on these things in nature and then seeing how they come up in scripture. And they're not just disparate metaphors, the idea of dwelling in the vine and being nourished by it, and then it coming to fruit, and then that being connected also with the metaphor of wine and Eucharistic. They're families of metaphors. They are related, they connect, and they intertwine.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
And it just gives,
and I think
it gives the sense of just an abundance of meaning, more than is, I think that more than we notice most of the time, and the more we pay attention, the more that there is there to pay attention to.
And you notice that even in your discussion of metaphor, which you might think was an abstract word, you needed to avail yourself of a metaphor.
Yeah.
You said there are families of metaphors that are related. Now, a literalist will come along and say metaphors are not male and female. They don't copulate. They don't have children. You're talking about a literary device. How can you have a family? But everybody understands immediately that you can't describe the relatedness of these invisible things without using a metaphor drawn from the relatedness of visible things.
Yes. And that the more you pay attention to the visible things, the greater clarity you begin to have about the invisible things.
Yeah, that's exactly the case. Yeah, I mean, and that's why I think poetry in particular mustn't rush to metaphors. I mean, one of the things about cliches, I mean, cliches have been described as dead language that won't lie down, which is, another metaphor, of course. But there are embedded metaphors in language, which people forget are metaphors. And that's how you come to mix metaphors. That's people say ridiculous things like, or they use a metaphor which is totally inappropriate. Like this booklet gives you the secret of hatching eggs in a nutshell, or the economy of the raw was moving in a vicious circle of interdependent bottlenecks. I mean, the reason why people, or the famous one, all along the I smell a rat, we must nip it in the bud. Now the fact that people can do that means they've forgotten they're using metaphors, and it means that somebody has rushed too quickly from the image to the, and one of the things that poetry does, it slows down language, and so I took a whole sonnet over one metaphor, and I could have gone on further. So if you took the kind of either I smell a rat or nip it in the bud, and really thought about rats, or thought about what happens to flowers when they're in bud, and what would happen to a flower if it was cut before it could blossom, you could breathe new life, to use another metaphor, back into that metaphor by stopping and paying attention. That's why Coleridge said that one of the purposes of poetry is to awaken the mind's attention.
Yeah. Which is why numerous things, which is why I was glad to speak with you first as we're beginning to talk about metaphor, and also why in the book at the end of every chapter I kind of included a cache of both poetry but also images. I think that we can sit with paintings sometimes and stories and music, because I think that all of those things in different ways slow down our attention and invite us to pay more attention to the world and more attention to the words we use, and can open up for us. I think if you slowed down the metaphor of smelling a rat, you might both understand the metaphor better, but you would also probably understand the thing you were trying to describe, whether that was, and so that was one of my goals. And I think I both referenced some things from you, but also poems that I had encountered through your own work. So I included in the chapter on love, the Robert Hayden poem on
those Sunday mornings.
those Sunday mornings, and which has just been something that I've ever since I encountered it in your I think it's that's the Advent book, isn't it? I think it's
the Advent trilogy, yeah.
Yes. So as we both wind down today's conversation, though we could have many, many more things to say, you have spent a great deal of your life giving people poetry to slow down their attention to things, and especially when it comes to the church year and to things. So where can people find your poetry and your work?
So my poetry publisher is Canterbury Press, but I think my books are available as much in America as here. The book Sounding the Seasons was really that sort of kicked it off. It's a set of 70 sonnets for the Christian year. Actually, I have some exciting news which I can reveal for the first time in a podcast, which is that it's actually it was published over 10 years ago, so about 12 years ago. So we're slightly missing the 10th anniversary. But there is going to be a new, probably out late summer, there's going to be a new revised and expanded edition.
Wonderful.
So having lived with that book for about 12 years, I thought, I've got a lot about the Passion, I've got the Stations of the Cross, but I haven't got enough about the resurrection. And there are some of the saints that I miss. So I'm basically going to do an expanded, I don't quite yet know how many more, but there'll be, I should think 20 or more new sonnets in it, and it'll have a new introduction and so on. So I'm actually working on revising that book now. My poetry is also quite a lot of it on my blog, which is a WordPress blog on my name, very easy, it's an unusual name, easy to find. But since the lockdown, I've started a little YouTube channel, which I originally did thinking a dozen of my students, whom normally my way of being chaplain is my door is there. Anybody who likes can knock on it at any time and come in and we'll have a little chat, and I'll perhaps pull a book off the shelf and read something for them. So I thought I'm going to carry on doing that no matter what. And I taught myself YouTube one morning, which is not natural to me, but and my wife kindly agreed to be the proxy visitor. And it's a sort of point of view thing. You knock on the door and come in. And I thought this would be for, as I say, a dozen students. And now there are about 25,000 people have subscribed to it. So it seems to be meeting a need. And again, I think that's probably fairly easy to find on YouTube. But I often read other people's poetry, or I read bits of Lewis or Tolkien or Shakespeare, or literally I think about it about 10 or 15 minutes before Maggie's ready to film. And I say, when can you do me a film, dear? And she says, oh, I'll see in 10 minutes. I say, fine, that's enough. And I answer on my shelf and think about something to read.
No, it's really delightful. It's A Spell in the Library is the name of it.
Spell in the
Yes. And I had a very kind of busy term last year. I was teaching 2 classes in 2 different universities and traveling quite a bit. And I must admit that I enjoyed quite a few spells in the library as a way to calm down with a cup of tea. And they were always enjoyable. I often learned something new or heard something old and comforting. So people should definitely look that up. And is the Arthurian?
Yes, well, that's the other big, apart from this new edition, the big Poetic project is to retell the Arthur stories in a way that I hope is really accessible, but which restores, I feel some of the more contemporary retellings have missed out the mystery and certainly airbrushed the Christianity out, and which is a pretty extraordinary thing to do when the Grail is right at the heart of it. Anyway, I'm going to write in a ballad cycle what is effectively an epic poem about Arthur, and I've finished the first book of it, which is all the Grail material. And I was hoping that might come out. I mean, I want it very beautiful and to have lovely illustrations and be in hardback. So it may be a longer production, but end of next year or beginning of the following year, I hope to have the first volume out. And maybe that's all I'll manage. But my great plan is to do effectively the entire Matter of Britain, the whole Arthuriad, in 4 volumes. So that should keep me well occupied in my retirement. I have to learn to do less traveling in order to do this, though. So you may see not quite so much of me in the States as you have seen heretofore.
I know it is difficult with traveling because you say yes to things. Oh, years before before you know who or what you will be like. And then you must do the traveling. Well, thank you so much, Malcolm, for the beautiful readings and for your insights into metaphor and imagination. There's no one I would rather ask. So thank you for kicking this off.
Well, thank you, and all the best. And I was very glad to endorse your book, which I think is excellent. And it's very strong, it's deep, but it's also very accessible. It's not got any off-putting jargon in it. And I hope it'll really deepen people's lives. I was very glad to write a commendation for it.
Well, thank you. That's very kind.